Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we are continuing on with Greg Koukl's talk on new atheists and how their arguments fall apart when examined closely. So let's closely examine his examination.
But these guys don't just think Christians are wrong. They think Christians are dangerous.
So is that what defines a new atheist? Someone who thinks Christians are dangerous? Well, here's my thought on the matter. I'm not going to defend Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, or Dennett or their positions. They do that themselves in their books and talks. But what I will say is that religion definitely can be dangerous. If I deny my kids medical attention that they need to survive and they die as a result, I go to prison. But if I say I did it because of religious beliefs, then at most I get a slap on the wrist. There are several religious organizations that promote anti-science and bigotry, and they currently have an active hand in running the US government, which right now seems intent on ignoring science in favor of promoting positions designed to make Trump look good in the moment in exchange for long-term consequences, often with appeals to Bible verses about leaders being ordained by God. So yes, religion does real harm, and what good it does can be done without being tied to a religion. So I am of the opinion that the world would be a better place without religion, but I am also of a rather live and let live mindset, where I will agree that everyone has the right to their own personal religious beliefs, but I would argue that the right stops when it starts affecting other people who don't share your belief.
Look at Hitchens' title, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything.
Yeah, it's a catchy title that will have people reading it who both agree and disagree with it, because that's what a good title does. It draws you in. Make it shocking and controversial, and it works even better. Now, sure, in Hitchens' case, he was not really being hyperbolic with the title. I'm pretty sure he would stand by that statement unequivocally, but like I said, I'm not here to defend his statements.
These people think that religion drives us back into the Dark Ages.
I wouldn't be so drastic. I don't think it drives us back into the Dark Ages, but I would say that at the very least, it does not help us advance at all. There definitely haven't been any scientific advances that are directly attributable to religion. What about humanitarian advances? Now, certainly religion was used as one of the reasons to end slavery in the US, but the problem here is that the very same religion and the very same religious text was also used to support the continuation of slavery in the US, so that one cancels itself out. Same thing for the advancement of civil rights. For every religious person on the side of a civil right, there is at least one against it. Depending on the right we're talking about, sometimes more than one. It seems to me that in these issues it would be easier to work it out if we left religion out of it. Forget what the Bible says about same-sex marriage. What are the actual arguments for and against? It is a much easier issue to solve if we don't involve religion.
In fact, I have a friend who's a broadcaster in the States. His name is Dennis Prager.
Uh-oh. Dennis Prager? Of PragerU? If you're citing him as a reference for anything, I can pretty much guarantee that whatever you're citing him for is completely wrong.
He made the observation that at least in the States, for the last 200 years, it's been pretty much the fundamentalist Christian religious crowd that's been running things, and it's produced pretty much nothing but liberty, prosperity, and freedom.
Yeah, there we go, called it. Firstly, a good chunk of the Founding Fathers were not Christian, much less fundamentalists. One of Thomas Jefferson's most famous acts was his rewriting of the Bible by cutting out the verses that he liked and pasting them into a new book, the Jefferson Bible. He pretty much ditched all of the supernatural elements, being a bit of a naturalist himself. Is this the kind of action that a fundamentalist Christian would do? I mean, they kinda do it when they decide which specific verses to focus on to the exclusion of others, but they never admit that they do it. And yeah, in the last 200 years, there obviously hasn't been any time in American history where deeply religious people ever did any oppressing of others. It's all been freedom and liberty. The slaves were freed under Lincoln's administration. You know Lincoln, the guy who, when running for Congress, had to counter rumors of his non-religious nature by publishing a pamphlet that stated, "That I am not a member of any Christian church is true, but I have never denied the truth of scriptures, and I have never spoken with intentional disrespect of religion in general, or any denomination of Christians in particular." So the slaves were being kept by those who were the fundamentalists, while the moderate, who openly admitted to not being a member of any particular church, and whose strongest affirmation of the religion is that he never denied the truth of scripture, he's the guy who is usually credited with freeing the slaves, though certainly he was not acting in a vacuum. I could go on, but you get the picture. Don't use Prager as a source for anything.
And it seems to me that, by and large, the new atheists' challenges fall into three categories. And here they are. They think that reason is on their side. That is, belief in God and religion is irrational.
Well, philosophy is a hell of a thing. You can have perfectly rational, reasonable people on opposing sides of an issue such as the God proposition. So I would not agree that a belief in God is inherently irrational. I would simply say that I am unconvinced by the arguments supporting a God proposition.
That's the first one. Secondly, they believe that science is on their side, that the discoveries of science have squeezed God out of the picture.
It's not so much that science has squeezed God out of the picture, but rather that we've had gods as the explanation for phenomena in the past that we now have scientific explanations for, and every year we make new scientific discoveries and find new scientific explanations for phenomena. So at this point, the God proposition has lost its scientific value. That doesn't mean that scientists can't believe in God, many do. But the best scientists are the ones who don't look for supernatural explanations in their work, regardless of their private beliefs about the supernatural.
And if you're going to be scientific and have a reasonable, rational, scientific view of the world, you do not countenance things like gods and souls and spirits and demons and heavens and hells and those kinds of things.
I mean, there's no scientific evidence for any of that stuff. Sure, scientists and science-minded people are free to believe in those things, but proposing demons, angels, souls, or other supernatural things as an explanation for something that is observable and testable has never panned out. It's one of those things where, before presenting something like a demon as an explanation for a phenomenon, you first have to demonstrate that demons exist, which, if they did, it would probably be scientifically impossible to prove it. So, belief in those things is one thing. Proposing those things as explanations is something else.
Finally, they think that morality is on their side.
You've got a book that sentences rape victims to be married to the rapist and tells you just how much you're allowed to beat your slaves. I don't. If you want to claim the moral high ground, you have to somehow climb out of the moral ditch that the Bible has you starting in first. And you can see this because different groups of Christians have different methods of dealing with these passages. Everything from justifying them as somehow moral despite their obvious immorality, to presenting the idea that God gave different rules to different cultures at different times based on what that culture could handle, to just accepting the fact that the Bible was written by human beings, so sometimes there's bad stuff in it. But no matter the explanation, Christianity starts the moral discussion at a disadvantage.
And this is evidenced when they raise as a challenge the problem of evil in general.
Yeah, the problem of evil. That is not a human moral problem, that's a problem for God. That's the idea that God is present to witness every human misdeed, and had the ability to stop it. And yeah, this is usually hand-waved away with an appeal to free will, as if God hasn't violated free will in the Bible. But even if free will were an adequate excuse for human misdeeds, God still gets credit for inventing a universe where it's possible for babies to get cancer, so, yeah.
The existence of evil in the world as a challenge against theists, and they point at specific examples of religious evil that they see in history.
Yes, examples of immoral actions performed by religious institutions and religious people are also evidence against a moral God. It's not just that there are some bad people who are religious, just like there are some bad people who are atheists, because bad people are everywhere in every group. It's that the bad people who are religious, by all appearances, honestly believe that God is telling them to do the bad things that they've done. Now, of course, I'm talking about things like the Crusades and the witch hunts here. I don't actually think that the priests believe God wants them to molest children. But if the higher-ups in the various churches that have that problem actually believe in a God, then they act as though they believe God wants them to protect these molesters from facing any consequences for their actions. Now, my problem here is that if I were God...
Well, if I was God, don't you dare to take the name of the Lord in vain.
I would not want institutions that claim to operate with my blessing behaving in the ways that a lot of religious institutions behave in. So I would at least show up and say, hey guys, this organization over here, you know, the one that's doing real harm to your children? Yeah, they're not working for me and I'm not associated with them in any way. I mean, really, if I were God, I would just stop the children from being abused in the first place, but if that somehow violated free will that I had set up earlier, God could still show up and condemn the actions of those that claim to be acting on his behalf. How would that violate free will? Well, there are two potential responses that I am aware of. The first is that this kind of confirmation of God's existence would remove free will from the equation. We'd all be believers then. To which I would point out that Satan, if he exists, knows for sure that God exists, and yet he still rebels against him, so clearly the knowledge of God's existence doesn't affect free will. And the other is essentially an appeal to mysterious ways. It's part of God's plan, and will work out for the best in the end. But really, God is supposed to be all-powerful. Surely he could come up with a plan that is better than having children get molested by his priests.
9/11, the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York City. Ever since then, there has been this sense that religious folk, particularly fundamentalists, and here no distinction is made with the talking heads that ought to know better between fundamentalist Muslims and fundamentalist Christians, because the fundamentalist Christian likely would pray for you, while the fundamentalist Muslim likely would kill you.
Tell that to the fundamentalist Christians who bomb abortion clinics and assassinate the doctors that work there. There's a terrorist organization operating in the United States right now called the Army of God. They're not a Muslim organization. There's a long list on Wikipedia about anti-abortion violence. When you dig into most of those events, the perpetrators can usually be found to be fundamentalist Christians. Now, I get that the Quran makes it easier to justify violence against the non-believers than the Bible does, but don't tell me that fundamentalist Christians will pray for you instead of kill you, given the fact that fundamentalist Christians can be quite violent when they want to be.
This distinction needs to be made, but these guys aren't making the distinction. You're a fundamentalist, you're dangerous.
I forget who said it. It was probably one of the Four Horsemen guys, but it was something along the lines of, the problem isn't fundamentalism, it's the fundamentals that are being held to. In almost every religion, the religion paints people of other religions, or no religion, as being others, outsiders, less than. As soon as you start thinking of one group of people as being more important than another group of people, it becomes easier to justify violence against the ones that are perceived as less important. Fetuses are more important than the doctors who sometimes abort them, so killing the doctor is justified. Infidels are to be judged by Allah, and Allah rewards those who dies in his service, so suicide attacks are justified. Hell, in the case of Islam, if you accept the wrong version of it, you are considered an infidel. And actually, the same could be said of Christianity. How many chick tracts are there about the evils of the Catholic Church? To an outsider, y'all are the same religion. One just has fancier hats. You still worship Jesus. You still pretend to consume his flesh and blood. You still have vicarious redemption. But to a fundamentalist evangelical, the Catholic Church is the Antichrist. At least to some of them. That's another problem. The denominations can't even agree on what the fundamentals of the religion even are. So a fundamentalist Baptist will behave differently than a fundamentalist Lutheran. So to present Christian fundamentalism as something that is homogeneous and generally good is disingenuous to say the least. Now he starts breaking down the 3 points that he made earlier about belief in God being rational, scientific, and moral, but as I already pointed out, I am of the opinion that perfectly rational people can make a God belief work for them, so I'm skipping most of the first bit. But there is some of it that I'd like you to see. To set the stage, he has categorized atheist arguments against Christianity into two general categories, trash talk and one as yet unnamed category. His strategy for dealing with the trash talk category is to simply ask, so what? And this is the kind of argument that he presents as being an atheist argument.
And here I'm using this tactic. What if it turns out that what you say is, and this is your challenge against us, what if it turns out that your challenge is accurate, the point you're making is accurate? What follows from that? Christians are dumb, therefore Christianity is false?
That is the quality of argument that he is attributing to atheists. I have never heard an atheist make that argument. Now, certainly I have heard several make the statement that Christians are dumb, but I've never heard that statement used as an argument to justify the conclusion that God doesn't exist. And he spends a lot of time on this complete and utter straw man of an argument. And on top of that, he started it off with a story about how the staff at a university he was about to lecture at told him that the students at that university thought Christians are dumb. Watch my video on framing to see what I think of that kind of tactic. I just find it interesting that he mentions earlier in the video just how sophisticated and charming and convincing these Four Horsemen guys are, but then he presents Christians are dumb as if it's one of their potential arguments. The next is Christians are hypocrites. Like, yeah, these are things that have been said, but they aren't being used as the actual arguments. At least not that I've ever seen, though certainly I have seen characters in movies use the Christians are hypocrites argument, but I don't think fictional characters really count here.
Now there's another group that of ideas that I'm going to call us silly logic.
Oh, I'm looking forward to this.
What is silly logic? These are arguments in which the conclusions do actually address the issue. So they're different from trash talk. They're really more on point, but they still fail to make their point.
Ah, so like the ontological argument for God, which can be boiled down to God is defined as being necessary in all possible worlds. If he is necessary in all possible worlds, then he is necessary in the real world. Therefore, he exists. That's some silly logic right there.
These are called non sequiturs in logic. In other words, you can't get there from here. If you follow this line, you can't get to the conclusion that you really say you're getting to.
That has been my impression of every logical argument in favor of a God that I've ever seen. There always seems to be an assumed conclusion hidden in one or more of the premises.
Here's what Christopher Hitchens says. He notes that any person looking to nature for evidence of design has to face the fact that 90% of all species ever designed are now extinct.
Does he say that? That seems a bit ineloquent for Hitchens. I'd be willing to bet that you're paraphrasing to make it sound less reasonable than it actually is. Let's let him say it for himself.
You want your God to take responsibility for the huge number of collapsing stars and imploding galaxies and destroyed universes and failed solar systems that have left us in this tiny corner on the one planet in this petty solar system that can support life some of the time on some of its surface. And you want a creator who's filled this earth with species since life began, 99% of which are now extinct already. And this is some design, isn't it?
It seems to me that rather than being an argument in itself, this is simply a counter-argument against the argument from design. You say we are all designed. I say, well, that designer did a bad job. 99.9% of his design has failed.
And he takes this then as evidence against a designer.
Yeah, it exposes one of the flaws in the argument from design, and where it goes from there depends on your position. If you're a young Earth creationist, I would bring up the fact that Noah had to save a bunch of animals that God knew were going to go extinct right after the flood anyway, so what's the point? If you accept an old Earth and evolution, then I would ask about the possibility of a loving God designing a system that requires death and suffering on massive scales for millions of years before finally reaching humanity, the creature that he had set out to create from the get-go. So it's not so much that it is itself an argument, it's more of a starting point for continuing the discussion.
So what is his point? His point is, maybe we'll simplify his argument here. If a thing were really designed, it wouldn't go extinct, but things go extinct, so therefore they weren't designed. Anything that wasn't designed, that goes extinct, obviously wasn't designed. Okay, so now I want to ask you a question to see whether this sequencing argument is going to work. Is he onto something here? So here's the question. How many people here own a buggy whip?
From here, he goes into how buggy whips are designed, but we no longer have use for them, so they effectively went extinct. To which I would ask, isn't God supposed to be perfect? Buggy whips aren't used anymore because we found a better way to move ourselves from point A to point B. God, being all-powerful and all-knowing, should have known the optimal arrangement of species on the planet to begin with, and didn't have to create a bunch of species for the sole purpose of dying off at the directed time. So, yes, fallible humans invent things that later become obsolete. So, if you'd like your God to be fallible and unable to account for future events, then that's fine, I guess, but it doesn't really help with your argument. Okay, that's where I'll leave it for today. I've got to start picking shorter videos. What is this now, 3 series that I'm working on at once between Pendleton, Gay Sex Yucky Guy, and Greg Koukl? Well, at least I don't have to hunt down new videos for a little bit. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Paul Reed, who I like to think is secretly Paul Reed Smith, watching my videos but having to leave off the Smith and spell Reed differently to remain anonymous. I'll keep your secret, but only if you send me an autographed McCarty 594 Graveyard 2. Anyway, Paul says, the important part of that verse he's riffing off of is the first line, and God gave them up to blah blah blah. In other words, God made them stop being cisnormative and take up same-sex acts against their will. This was in response to Romans 1:26 being used to condemn same-sex relationships. And yeah, this is also one of the verses that can be used as evidence that God doesn't actually want us to have free will. They didn't choose vile affections. God gave them over to vile affections. And yeah, there are apologetics for this, but as is usually the case, they remain unconvincing. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the buggy whips that keep the car that is my channel running. If you'd like to be obsolete but still designed, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!